Thank you very much. I'm quite excited to be here. This is my first visit to Elon University, and the truth is, as I was telling our host, I had no idea it existed until I got the invitation to come. But it's really, I feel like, I don't know, like Columbus discovered a whole new world. It's really to then discover a very vital, dynamic, growing university with a remarkable Jewish studies and Jewish community. So it's really quite exciting. And as I say, right now I'm sort of feeling, behold, this wondrous new, brave new world. Anyway, thank you for inviting me and giving me the chance to reflect also about Israel somewhat in the Jewish Christian context. I would start by pointing out there's quite a small state. It's almost insignificant point on the map if you look at the total picture of the globe, let alone of the Middle East. But this particular small state draws an inordinate amount, a totally disproportionate amount of attention in the world, in the media, totally disproportionate to its actual size and its population. Although this country is smaller than the state of New Jersey, which at least if you live in New York like I do, is the ultimate image of puny. It's very small. But it gets media attention consistently, almost as a world power. In fact, I was struck some years back, there was a survey, they asked people, what their impression is of different countries and asked them to draw a picture of it. And typically when they talked about Israel, they drew a picture like Russia or China in terms of the size, because that's what they saw in the attention and in the responses to the country. It's a little bit like the survey of people's impression of how many Jews there are in the world. Again, when very typically it starts by 100 million, 200 million people sort of thing. Considering all the noise and tumult and attention, there must be that many out there. It often comes as a shock to realize that there are less than 14 million in the whole world. But this is characteristic, nevertheless, of the image and of the presence of Israel in the world. Sometimes this attention disproportion is negative, not just positive. I give you the case of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which of course consists mainly of the leading violators of human rights in the world, but that doesn't matter. The fact is that of the resolutions of this Commission on Human Rights, it's resolutions condemning a specific country for misbehavior or for violation of human rights. 80% of the resolutions denouncing a country for civil rights violations have been addressed to Israel. By comparison, none to the Soviet Union for what it did in Chechnya, or for China what it's doing in Tibet, and one could go on and on. But again, it's the totally disproportionate nature of the attention that is, I think, very striking. And one could go on and on. Despite its rather small size, its population is basically 7.5 million people total, of whom 6 million are Jewish. Despite the small population, Jane's, the Institute of Worldwide Assessment of Military, has estimated at one point that it's the 4th strongest army in the world. At another time, or more recently, said 6th strongest army in the world. We won't quibble. But again, there's sort of it's kind of a strange juxtaposition. You have these images of great power and of small or almost minuscule existence. And one could go on and on, despite the fact it's starting from a really minuscule population, 600,000 people in 1948, and with an extremely small GNP, it has had one of the most remarkable 70 years of growth, both in population, which is now 10 times the original population, and with a GNP that now matches that of all its immediate surrounding neighbors, which had spent most of those 70 years trying to destroy it, and which could have continued despite the growth, the achievement, the digging in, the becoming more established dimensions, continue to act as if this country has no right to be there, has no standing or actual existence. It's often not on their maps. So again, you have this very strange contrast of reality and vision and perception. I'm trying to understand that to some extent. I mean, one could go on and on. For example, again, it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and yet it's the only country in which there is a worldwide movement claiming that it's illegitimate, it's apartheid, it should be boycotted, and it should be eliminated. Again, how does one account for the variation or for the variety of perception? I'll give one last example because it comes closer to home to the Christian question. It's the only country in the Middle East whose Christian community is actually growing and has grown in the last century. In the rest of the Middle East, it has actually gone down or collapsed, depending on which country you're in. And there are serious conversations about the end of the, for example, Iraqi Christian community, literally the end, and Lebanon, where it's increasingly in danger, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the one country in the Middle East where the Christian population has grown dramatically, in fact, in the last 70 years. It is also the one country in which the Presbyterian Church of the United States voted to divest or demand to divest from any companies that do business with the state of Israel. So again, one tries to understand how do these images square with each other? How does the reality square with the perception? And my thesis tonight, quite simply, is, of course, I'm talking about Israel, in case you didn't know. I'm talking Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, obviously, and that's part of the story. But I think the explanation is that it is a real state, meaning it's a live nation, and like any real state, by the way, complicated, complex, and with many qualities and many limitations and many flaws, as any living community must be. But it is a real state which is seen in a much more distinctive way than any other state in the world through a theological lens, actually through more than one theological lens. So that it's not just what is the reality, it's also what do you see and what do you project onto this reality, because you have a framework, in this case a theological framework, that shapes what you think about and what you understand is how you interpret the facts as they come at you. And I wanted to sort of talk about that question because as I reflect upon it more and more, I've come to the conclusion that not only does this give important insight into the theological lens, into the religions that are looking at the state and why they look at it the way they look at it, but I think it's also, I've come to conclude that it's about where those religions are going and where they will come out that is very much reflected in how they end up perceiving or dealing with the state of Israel. So I'll start, in fact, not with the two lenses that I promised in the title, but a third theological lens, because Israel turns out to be a real state that is nevertheless viewed through theology, through ideology, through religious expectations by three major world religions. That is to say, Judaism itself, Christianity, and of course Islam. And I'll start with the third first, because in many ways that has set the framework of this conflict of perception. Israel came into being in 1948, although of course it is a renewal, if you will, a reconstruction of a commonwealth that existed in that country. Actually, there were two commonwealths, Jewish nations that existed in that very country, in that very spot, thousands of years ago. And it is one of the things that evokes theology and evokes theological responses is the fact that very rarely in history, maybe it's the only time in history, where a nation having been dispossessed or exiled in this case loses its homeland and does not lose its character, its historic existence, or does not become something very different than a new location, where in effect, in this case, the people did come back to that site and rebuild the country. So I admit, I start with that reality that this is an unusual thing, and it evokes a kind of biblical or religious associations because it's not something that seems to be normal or simply a secular experience. The third lens, of course, then is Islam, and Israel came into being, the whole Zionist enterprise of building or rebuilding this country, which was considerably run down. And some of you may have read Mark Twain's visit to the Middle East, to Israel in the late 19th century, and where he describes, again, it's a total ruin and quite an empty and spare population. But at a time when the Jews came back, there were Jews there, I should come back, there were Jews who never left, and at no time in the past 2,000 years was the land of Palestine or of Israel empty of Jews completely. But you were talking a handful, you were talking a minority, you were talking, for the last 500-600 years before the State of Israel, a land which was part of the Ottoman Empire, and which the Jews, and for that matter, other religions were minorities and were not governing or sovereign in any way. But in that when they came back at a time when Islam as a religion was going through one of its, I don't know how to describe it, maybe one of its down periods, at a low point in Islamic history. By low point, I mean Islam had what is commonly called a failed modernization. Judaism and Christianity as religions, particularly in the West, which were their dominant, where the dominant communities existed and lived, went through modernization in a very substantial way. And I have to say, one of the things that they sometimes forget is that some of the more violent or savage things that people are upset about in Islam, people forget that those same qualities and those same texts and those same kinds of attitudes existed and exist in the Jewish and Christian traditions. But in the last 200-300 years, both religions underwent a very severe and serious critique by modern culture, yes, by modern secular culture, which challenged them both, which pointed out that religion is a source of war and hatred and destruction and violence. And that critique domesticated. It made the majority, both of Jews and of Christians, back away from some of those traditions. It made them turn their back on them and, if you will, bring out or take out the more humane, the more pacifist, the more restrained themes in their own tradition and put them front and center. So some people look and say, well, that's how could that be? But the answer is, if you look inside your own tradition, you'll find lots of parallels, except that they have, thanks to no small measure to the secular and to the modern civilization, they were sort of tamed or domesticated or put to the side. In the case of Islam, the modernization failed. It failed in part because the economic, political infrastructure did not support the development of modern values, modern culture, and therefore it never became strong enough to critique and to improve, filter, whatever language you want to use, Islam. But because Islam was at a low point, it also meant its medieval, and I think generally agreed upon, its somewhat more static and stagnant elements were uppermost at the time. And some of those elements are still very powerful and very dominant. And so, as a community, it was not prepared to deal with or to accept the notion that non-Muslims were coming to Muslim areas and were now becoming sort of a dynamic presence. Or to put another way, in traditional Islam, there is a tradition of superiority, authority of the Muslim religion. And within that framework, meaning believe that this is the ultimate, just as Christianity followed Judaism, and of course in Christian and in Muslim expectation to some extent replaced or superseded, so does Islam replace and supersede the other two Abrahamic religions, at least in unmodified medieval Islamic theology. So the idea that Jews would come and become literally independent or literally sovereign was seen as an unacceptable or impossible thing. There was room in Islam for minorities living as dhimmi or second-class citizens, but the notion that they could exercise independent authority and judgment and rule over Muslim was impossible. In fact, there's a further theological position that divides the world into Dar al-Islam, that part of the world that has been liberated and brought within the framework of Islam, and where justice and peace and all the other good qualities that Islam seeks to teach are uppermost. And there's Dar al-Harb. Everything else is the world of the place of the sword, meaning those are still in contention. The other viewpoints have no right to be there, particularly so if this land was ever part of Dar al-Islam, it cannot be transferred or removed and turned over to some other authority. So again, if Jews or Christians want to come and live as second-class citizens, dependent, that's okay. But the notion that you actually take it back and turn something which is Dar al-Islam into Dar al-Harb is unacceptable. In fact, that's the definition. If you turn it back, it's now the realm of war and of sword. It's not to be accepted. It's to be reversed, and if necessary, by war. So that was basically that. And then paradoxically enough, after the end of the colonial experience, which is to say, particularly after World War II, when the European colonizers, the imperialists, were removed and these countries were given their own independence, the leadership in many of these countries was not religious leadership, because the religion was sort of unable to deal with modernity and sort of drawn to the side, very much like Jewish fundamentalism. And Christian fundamentalists who were not engaged, they were trying to stay out of the influence of modern. So the leadership of the Arab world at that point was mostly secular, people who had gone to the West, and that very assimilation to the West is what gave them the strength to become politically active. But interestingly enough, they took over this particular quality and judgment. In other words, they were not prepared to make room for a new alternative authority. They really responded, this is not acceptable. There is a very sad and quite poignant scene. David Ben-Gurion, in 1934, the first prime minister of Israel, was at that time one of the leaders of the most important labor party, which was the dominant or the leading political party in the pre-state situation. And they were concerned that they were trying to see, is there some way of working out a relationship with the Arab population, with the local Arabs, so that would allow room for both communities to function and to function side by side. There were never good communal understandings, and the Zionist groups were hoping they could work something out. In fact, what happened was, starting in the 20s and late 20s, there were riots and pogroms. And so they really were saying, can we find an alternative way? And Graham met with what was an important Arab intellectual who was considered a moderate, and that's why Ben-Gurion went to him and thought this could be a person who could be an important leader in working out some sort of joint understanding and cooperation. And he came back and he reported this, that the fellow said to me, look, I know that the new settlements, the new development of the Zionist movement have really increased and improved the economy. They've given jobs, they've attracted a lot of inflow of Arab population too. He said, but frankly, the notion that you would actually come here and become some sort of independent or ruling community, wasn't yet clear that that was going to be the outcome, but he saw that. He said, it's just unacceptable. He said, I would rather it stay a ruin than it develop this way. And that, in a sense, was the major response to of the secular leadership, that in effect, this is Islam territory, and there's no room for any new or any independent alternative rulership. And that, in fact, is what's happened. So that when it became so widely spread as a basic attitude that those Arab leaders who considered an alternative were marginalized and, in fact, in many ways pushed aside, and they decided that for their own safety that they were not going to take that line. The classic case being Abdullah of Transjordan, which later became the Kingdom of Jordan. King Abdullah in the early 30s, when Great Britain separated off what is today Jordan from Palestine, Britain was given a mandate over both countries together, both areas together. It decided to separate off and create an Arab kingdom in Jordan, which it did. But it was so large and it was so underpopulated that Abdullah struck him. He needs economic development, so he opened up negotiations with the Zionist leadership to say maybe that Jews would move to Transjordan and help develop it. And of course, again, he told them if they will do that, they will be citizens, they will be treated nicely, they will not be, they can rest assured, depend on him, that they will not be victims of pogroms, etc. So he seriously negotiated that and then concluded, when it was over, that if he came out with this idea publicly and pushed it, he would be destroyed, he'd be killed. So he, after negotiating all the details, concluded it's too dangerous, too risky. He passed away. The same Abdullah met with Golda Meir before the UN resolution which established the state of Israel and the state of Palestine at that time as an Arab country, was going to go into effect, met with her privately to explore the possibility again of some sort of peace or some sort of a peaceful arrangement. It also turned out that he was not ready to support an Arab state in Palestine, but he wanted to take over the land as part of Jordan. But they negotiated the possibility that they would have a peace if Israel would not interfere with his takeover of the Arab designated territories, that he'd be made peace. And that's what that was the final offer understanding on both sides. As the decision to declare the states came closer, the Arab nations around Israel gathered together and concluded they would not accept this, and that they would, if the Jews went ahead and declared a state, that they would not accept the UN resolution, and they would invade and destroy it. And Abdullah was drafted, and he was appointed the head of the joint army that was going to invade and destroy Israel. And of course, in fact, as a result, it never went through with his idea of peace. In fact, it was one of the leaders of that army that invaded Israel and tried to destroy it in 1948. But again, and finally, after the war ended, as it did, and the Jews were victorious and the country survived, he then decided a third time that maybe he would try to make some peace possibility or some peace arrangements, which would be contingent, again, on his claim that Jordan would now own the Arab parts of Palestine that were designated by the UN. And of course, he was assassinated, and that was that. So what I'm saying is that the political secular leadership did not go very far, or felt culturally they could not go very far from the religious consensus that non-Islamite communities and groups could not be allowed to establish sovereignty or independent existence in this area. Now, this, I would argue, is not just because the theological side, namely the unreconstructed Islamic belief that it is superior and that it is the true religion which all those who live within it must recognize, and they recognize it by either becoming Muslims or by becoming tax-paying minorities that accept the fact that pay a special tax of recognition that they are in fact not equal citizens, but they have this secondary role. This whole vision and understanding of the basis of the relationship was so powerful and so strong that it did not deal with any of the other issues. And all the other issues, in fact, are the key problem of Islam itself and the Arab communities, by which I mean to say the successors of the imperialists themselves did not create democracies, they created dictatorships. They did not create dynamic developing economies. They basically continue to suffer from cronyism. They did not tackle the unfinished challenges, which again, it's not unique to Islam. It was Judaism and Christianity wrestling with that women were not only second-class citizens, but denied education, denied public roles, denied all kinds of activities that about 5 years ago, the UN development study written by Arab intellectuals in the Middle East made the point that they have this long list of unresolved serious social issues in the Arab world and in the world of Islam, which included illiteracy, the denial of women, etc., the whole absence of democracy, and concluded that these are the main problems of the Arab world. But instead what happened was projection outward of the weaknesses and the problems. The Jewish interference, the state of Israel, was the source of all these problems. And therefore, instead of addressing the question of, can you change the role of women, it all became, this is the great tradition, and it's these Jews, they're the problem. And again, literally, it took on the kind of familiar anti-Semitic and the kind of projection out of all the evils in the world. So literally, it became that Judaism, and there are, of course, sources in Islam as there are sources in Christianity, that the Jews are the devil, the Jews are violating all the basic human dignity, the Jews are, and they're the source of it all. And why is it that we have, well, the answer is it's a Jewish conspiracy. The Jews control the world. They control the West. Why has the West supported? Well, the answer is because they control the West, and of course the Jews own all the banks and they control all the media. And except the problem, this is the problem, that this is taken to be literal. And what's happened then, instead of dealing with the internal moral issues of Islam, there's a kind of projection outward. If we only get rid of this evil influence and model, we would not have all these problems. Islam in the Muslim world has become the world's leading source and supplier of anti-Semitism in the world. The Protocols of Elders of Zion are taken literally. And Anwar Sadat, who ended up making peace, to his great credit, the one Arab leader who really had the courage to try to change this pattern, interesting enough, nevertheless believed that the Jews, Protocols of Zion is not a fiction forgery of the Russian secret service, which is what it was, that the Jews have this secret council that conspired and controls the world. He really thought this is the true reality, and this is and as I'm sure you know, most of the Arab population of the Muslim world believes that the claim that, that the Jews the Mossad staged 9/11 and put up this front, blaming it on so-called Arab or Muslim terrorists. Not true. It was all a Mossad plot carried out by the Mossad, and that the claim to this day that on that morning, several thousand Jews were told in advance, don't come because today's the day, and they stayed home, and as a result, all the other people died, but they were spared because the Mossad naturally looks out for Jews before it does these kind of. Now again, you may think that this is a joke, except it's not a joke, and that's my point. In other words, as part of this ongoing inability to come to grips with the reality of the state of Israel, and again, not that it's never done anything that harmed or hurt Arab people, but instead of sort of trying to come to some real life grasp, there has been this theological lens, namely, they have no right to be there because this is Islamic territory, and therefore one lets loose all the ways that, by the way, Christianity did for much of its 2,000 years. The Jews have no right to exist. Now that Christ has come, they've been replaced. So how come they're still in existence? So the answer, as you know, is that you develop all kinds of theories that they don't really exist. They're the devil. The devil is keeping them alive, the synagogue of Satan. And one develops all those kind of things. They're not really human. That's why they're still going, but they really should have disappeared. And what's keeping alive is demonic and evil, ugly sources. And of course, that becomes the justification of doing terrible things to them. That's why you have a right to expel them or kill them. So the same process was unleashed within Islam. And the process has a double victim. One victim is that it puts Jews, Israel, as sort of outside the pale And one has a right to do that. One has a right to threaten to wipe it out. Iran does boastfully. One has a right to plan terror attacks that simply kill innocent people, doesn't matter. But the other victim, of course, is the inner capacity of Islam to self-correct, or for that matter, to make judgments as to right and wrong and accuracy and facticity as against demonic and conspiracy and other kinds of theories. So it has weakened considerably and damaged the theological lens has not only set the Muslim world against Israel, it has really damaged the Islamic world itself in terms of its capacity to deal with changing history or to deal with its own internal needs. And this is a great tragedy for Islam as much as it is, I think, for Israel. But that, I think, accounts, again, for the exaggerated and the extreme interpretations. So again, it's one thing if you say, to give an example, in the Gaza War, which Israel fought, I'll come back to that a little later, in response to thousands of rockets being shot into Israel from Gaza. And this turned out to be a very difficult war, and this, perhaps the smallest and most difficult part of it was the fact that the military, Hamas, was embedded within the civilian population. So how do you fight? And the answer is it's extremely difficult to fight without killing civilians. And it was a major challenge to the Israeli army. And despite supreme efforts, and I'll come back to that, the fact is that civilians were killed. And this is very tragic. But instead of an acknowledgement of the proportion and an acknowledgement of the fact that a good part of the problem was you deliberately embed military inside civilians so that they will be your shields or protected, or on the belief that Israel will not be able to strike back because they don't want to kill civilians, or if they do strike back, that this will hurt them in world opinion. Instead of acknowledging that or acknowledging the extent of the problem, it becomes this is a war crime. This was planned to begin with. Israel deliberately trying to wipe out all these people, et cetera, et cetera. So the first theological lens that has led to these very distorted pictures of how powerful Israel, how exaggerated its influence in the world, how evil its behavior is, has been this theological lens, which is not yet ready, at least not in the neighbor countries, to confront the full reality. Now, I have to say again, to be fair, in the last years, particularly as the conflict between Sunni and Shia has gotten more intense, there has been behind the scenes a greater willingness to cooperate, seeing Israel as a bulwark against Iran. I also have to acknowledge, and that's one of the great breakthroughs of the last 50 years, the peace treaty with Egypt, which again would not have happened but for the initiative of Anwar Sadat willing to come to Israel and willing to say, yes, we'll recognize your existence and deal with you as in a peaceful manner. Those were important breakthroughs, but they were isolated. And as you know, not only isolated, but again, a resurgent radical Islam, among other things, assassinated Sadat for having made this peace. The second theological lens, of course, is Judaism itself. So I guess what I'm trying to say to summarize this point is that what will happen in the future relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors, in many ways, is a test of what happens inside Islam. To the extent that Islam will be able to have this delayed modernization, or if you will, resurgence of its own moderates, who would do for Islam what Jews and Christians mostly did for their religion, which is to say, to bring to the forefront its humane side, its peaceful side, its willingness to recognize the existence and honor and respect the place of other religions in the same framework. To that extent, I think this pattern I'm describing may be ended and changed. To the extent that that remains the dominant force in Islam, I think the continuing demonization and the continuing attempt to exclude and destroy Israel will continue. And of course, I think of that every time we talk about occupation. The reason Israel is in fact the master of the Palestinian territories is because in 1967, the Arab countries, which had failed in 1948 to wipe out the state of Israel, again, led by, a revolutionary socialist, as against the earlier regime, Nasser, decided this was the time to push Israel away or into the sea, and attempted or began the process of declaring war on Israel. And of course, in that war, Israel asked Jordan not to intervene and promised it would not intervene. It would not touch any of the Jordanian territories, which of course the West Bank, Palestine, was in fact Jordanian territory. It wasn't a Palestinian state. But again, these things feed each other. By the second or third day of the war, Israel had won that war already, but the Arab media reporting, again, not reality, particularly when it comes to Jewish and Israel, you don't have obligation to all the facts. They were reporting a huge, great success for the Arab armies and Air Force, and literally convinced King Hussein, who had planned to stay out and made this promise to Israel he would not invade and they would not touch his territories, could not resist the pull of the street and the belief that here was a war which he would lose out on. And this was his chance to, and so they joined the war on the third or fourth day of the Six-Day War. And in fact, as it turned out, the opposite, of course, had happened, and the territory fell into Israel's hands. So what is the occupation? People forget started by a war of self-defense against genocide. Now I come to the second theological lens, which of course is the Jewish theological lens. Now here again, people are sort of aware, but maybe not so aware, of the paradox of seeing Israel through a theological lens. Israel, the Zionist enterprise, was of course the Jewish dream. It was the heart of Jewish religion. During all those years when they were in Israel, in the land of Israel, it was a central part of the religion. But during the years of exile, and this is unique, they kept alive the dream. Every holiday ends with this call next year in Jerusalem. The prayers, the rituals, all of that kept alive this dream of being back in Israel. But the paradox is that by the 19th century, Judaism was in many ways where Islam was. It was pre-modern, it was passive, it was not able to participate and join in the modernization process. So as a result, the Jews were politically passive and inactive. And the majority of Orthodox, of religiously traditional Jews, did not join the Zionist movement. In fact, the leadership opposed the Zionist movement. Why? Because they said you have to wait for the Messiah. Because God will bring us back to the land of Israel. Because this is all theological. It's not in human hands. It's impious to take power and to try to go back to the land. God will bring us back, and therefore the Zionist movement is a rebellion against God. Well, given that religious position, the truth is, so who would become a Zionist or who would join? The answer was, bluntly, in the beginning, the majority were non-religious Jews. They were Jews who revolted against the tradition, saying, I'm sick and tired of being a minority, persecuted, suffering discrimination in places like Russia, Poland, and I want to go to a place where I can be. Now, where do you go? The answer is millions of Jews moved from Russia to America, or from Poland to America, or to Western Europe. But a small group said, no, I want to recover my own nationality, my own place. So paradoxically, there is a theological lens there. These were officially secular Jews, but they said, where will I go? Well, the country I want to go to is my Bible's country, the land of Israel. And so it turned out, now they were joined by some religious Jews, but that was a minority. In the first pre-state days, the majority of the settlers, the rebuilders of the land of Israel, were officially non-religious Jews, because the religion was not mature enough and able enough to understand the centrality of political life and the fact that they were living in a world in which without a nation, without citizenship, you would not have dignity. So the extent that there was a theological lens, it was that the so-called secular Jews who were rebelling against religion nevertheless took with them the religious tradition that this is my country, this is my homeland, And they had a vision: could you restore Jewish dignity? Could you restore Jewish culture, a Hebrew culture? The language hadn't been spoken for 2,000 years. Could you restore a Hebrew culture in a living community? These are, again, remarkable accomplishments, but paradoxically not particularly formally religious. And that's how it started. Now, with the successful creation of the state, and when the UN voted to allow both a Jewish state and an Arab state to come into being, again, it kind of paradoxically, here's where the rest of the Jews of the world kind of woke up. And of course, what preceded that was the Holocaust. The climax of Jewish suffering, the climax of Jewish destruction, was so powerful that overwhelmingly the Jews of the world, both the religious Jews who had resisted because it's impious, and the secular or liberal or liberal denominational Jews who said, well, I'm a citizen of America, I don't need Zionism, both concluded that the Jewish people had to have a place of guaranteed security and dignity, lest such a catastrophic event take place. And so paradoxically, the whole Jewish world became politically Zionist, whereas up until 1948, the majority were religiously Zionist, but not particularly concretely. So it shifted over to support a real country in a real state, this shift in the theological lens. Now here we come to the flip paradox of this theological lens. The religious Jews, again, a minority had supported the state, were tremendously moved by the creation of the state to the point where, for many religious Jews, and particularly for those who had been Zionists before, this was like a miracle. This was messianic. The Messiah hadn't come. But think about it. Again, it was a miracle. The 600,000 people managed to survive an onslaught of 100 million people around them, of 5 armies, and with really on a shoestring and by the narrowest of margins survived. That in turn, this unleashed these tremendous life forces. And I would stress this is my second point about theological lens. But here, both religious and I think non-religious Jews alike sensed not that the Holocaust is the cause of Israel or the justification of Israel. What they sensed was the Holocaust was the most total attack on Jewish existence and on Jewish religion. Jewish religion, like Christianity, is all about creating a world full of life, our belief that life is going to win out, that this world can be repaired. So it's totally supportive of human dignity and human life. And here came the total contradiction of that. And not only denial of dignity, degrading before you kill the people, humiliating, destroying every religious possible phenomenon in this community before you kill them, but a conviction, that death could wipe it out altogether. A plan, conscious plan to wipe out every last Jew, even though they didn't get there. I think the whole Jewish world sort of realized that you can't go on being a Jew, you can't go on believing in this idea, Jewish idea of life, or of human dignity, or that the world can be repaired, as if nothing happened. It was almost like a question, do you still believe in life? Do you still think there's any legitimacy or validity? And again, many Jews ask that question. Maybe the thing to do if you're a Jew is to hide, is to go to another country where they don't know you, and make believe you're not Jewish because it's a death sentence. It's such a risky and dangerous thing. But overwhelmingly, it became a theological statement of life. In other words, I still believe in life. How do I show that? I go on living as a Jew. I still believe in the Jewish covenant, the promise that this generation, that we will eventually now be restored to the land of Israel, but achieve that ideal society and a perfect world. And overwhelmingly, this tremendous surge of support, identification with, because it became, even for a secular Jew, this is the statement of religious meaning. This is a statement of the value of life. This is a statement of that the good guys are going to win in history, which of course is the Jewish and Christian claim, not always. So the second theological dimension of Israel from a Jewish point of view was that overwhelmingly the community identified this not just as a great historical event, but also as a kind of renewal or reaffirmation of religion, that the Jewish mission was unfinished and still able of creating the ideal society, which in the ideal Jewish vision would be a model for the rest of the world. And it sounds, well, I'm living in America, what has it got to do with Israel? But the answer was twofold. One is that I'm building a model society because I live in this country, I love this country, I'm not going to go there. But I'm participating, I'm supporting, I'm enabling a building of an ideal society that affects the whole world. And there's not even, no less a dimension, I will do in America and other places a kind of a mini model, a community that's able to create a nurturing framework for life and affirmation. Now, the final paradox of this theological lens was that even more than 1948, the 1967 victory unleashed this within the religious community now, really messianic ideas. I mean, not just that Israel survived. My God, we thought we're going to have this small, truncated little state by a paradox of history. The majority of the biblical sites were in the Arab-designated territories, and we thought we'd have to live without them. And Hebron, which was the first major city of Abraham, is going to be part of an Arab country. And one could go on and on. And suddenly, what appeared to be miraculous, instead of wiping out, this is an unparalleled victory. So it unleashed an incredible kind of religious messianic fervor within the religious community. And people said, here, God has given us, we thought politically you're bound to make a reasonable compromise, which is, of course, what the Zionist movement did. Say, let the Arabs live in their state and they will live in our state, and this is the only way we can find room for both communities. In the religious community, it kind of unleashed a different kind of emotional, theological frenzy. You know, this is a chance to have the whole country, the whole biblical world given back to us. Are we going to be ungrateful? Are we going to say that God gave us a second chance, and we're going to say, no, we're going to go on making political compromise deals with the other side? So it's a kind of, it became a test of a very powerful religious emotion. Could it self-control? Could it make room for the Arab dignity? Or would it be carried away and say, no, it has a chance for greatness, for biblical grandeur, and to build a biblical Israel that really has all of the great biblical territory within it. The price, of course, of applying this theology is obvious to you too. The only way you're going to successfully do that would be running the risk of having to suppress or control the Palestinians and suppress them in order to achieve your greatness. And the honest answer is that in this case, again, the theology, as in the case of Islam, pushed these people to say they're not important, they're just secondary characters, they're not equivalent. Or, again, to be fair, look, I'll create a country, they will have a place in it, they'll be citizens, I'm not going to mistreat them, but they'll have to live, under my government and under my sovereignty, and so on. And this became the founding, driving vision of what the so-called settlement policy has been. I think, as in the case of Islam and the case of Christianity before that, when you do it that way, you always run the risk of one theological stand leads to another, and it becomes the enemy of reality. Thus, for example, many of the people on this side kept saying, we're not bound by the estimate of the generals or of the political leadership that you have to make a compromise. You can't control it, you can't indefinitely. We'll control it for security purposes, but you have to work out some living arrangement. It became, no, we have the capacity to do anything, and we have a capacity to create better alternatives, and we will, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get the extremists who then begin to say, not just that, we have God on our side, and not only are we going to win in any clash, but since God is on our side, we have the right to subdue them and support them. And if they can't live under our rulership, then either let them go or put them down, and put them down with an iron fist. And if that's necessary, that's the price. So here again, the paradox that when you see the real country through a theological lens, the question is which theological lens is going to win out? The lens that says Judaism's vision is to create a good society based on justice and equal dignity and human rights? Or is it Judaism the vision of a triumphant, reestablished Jewish state that rules over the entire extent and glory of the thing? Which of these inner themes? Because paradoxically enough, the secular Jews who started the movement created democracy. The people who are pushing for the settlement, they accept that this is the rules right now. It's democracy, but in their mind, it's not democracy. It's about God. It's about, and in fact, there have been tensions. I'll give you a trivial example of that tension, of course, is that as part of the democratic structure of Israel, because there was a minority that was religious Jews, when the state was declared, the secular majority agreed to give the minority, religious minority, religious establishment and protection, a guarantee that they would have full government services, full equality, full everything else with the secular Jews. The catch being, of course, that there were no serious reform or conservative or liberal movements at the time. So this grant of religious establishment was given to Muslims, to Christians, and to Jews, but in this case, Jews were the Orthodox Jews only, because they were the only group that was there. As this theological lens becomes stronger, this group has become established in the rabbinate, established in legal courts, and has been very resistant to letting and recognizing equal rights for non-Orthodox Jews, has been reluctant or unwilling to make the internal changes that give women full equal dignity, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's a paradox. Because the rules were established by democracy, they've had to make concessions. And the truth is, for the whole 40 years, 70 years of the state, the Supreme Court in Israel, very much like in America, has been continuously cutting away at this monopoly privilege. And there's no question in my mind that before it's going to be disestablished. But you see, when theology, or that side of theology, rules over reality, it takes and it creates abuses. Hence, as I'm sure you've read in the papers too, the sort of the continuous rejection, denial, or degradation, degrading attitudes toward liberal movements, which now have begun to grow in Israel. The third theological lens, and I'll finish, I'm sorry I ran a little longer than I wanted to, is of course the Christian theological lens. So here again, the paradox, the Christian theological lens is in part because the Christians do have a profound and deep connection to the Bible, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was a theological tradition that Christianity had superseded Judaism. That's the New Testament is not a continuation, it's a replacement, which dominated Jewish-Christian relations theologically until World War II, really, until the Holocaust, when Christianity began this remarkable transformation, I would call it repentance, remarkable spiritual transformation of cleaning out these traditions and reaffirming the dignity, the legitimacy, the role of Judaism in the divine economy. But in this previous tradition, where Jews were superseded, inferior, outsiders, the Christian religious position was that the land of Israel, that's no longer physically the Holy Land. The Holy Land is a spiritual Israel. We're no longer the physical Jews, we're the Christian spiritual Jews, the new Israel. And by that standard, Christians opposed, more overwhelmingly opposed, Zionism in the early days. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, went to the Pope trying to get support. He went to European leaders, including the Pope, and met with not the Pope, wouldn't give an audience, but Cardinal Mary de Val, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, met with him and he explained the vision of Zionism, go back to Israel, build a state. And Mary said, what are you talking about? He said, as long as you haven't accepted Christ, you have to be homeless. You have to be in exile. That's your punishment. So how can you expect me to support Zionism? It would be a violation of my religious beliefs. It would be undercutting my own traditions. And the church did not recognize the state of Israel when it was born, in part because it could not deal with the theological lens, could not make room for a real-life physical state of Israel. Now, paradoxically, at the very same time, and particularly in America, and particularly in Protestant circles, those groups which take the New Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, very seriously, read this Bible, and this Bible always said it. So for them, it wasn't just simply the replacement. They believed that this tradition itself also is real. And the Bible, after all, said, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And so you had a whole, particularly strong in the Protestant movement, a kind of a Christian Zionism. Again, took different forms, and it's taken a different form after the state was declared. But this Christian Zionism, which was sympathetic. So again, the question is, which theological lens will you judge the state by? In the course of the revision of Christian teachings about Jews, most of that initial revision took the form of recognizing that the Jewish people is coming back to life in Israel, sees Israel as central to its existence and its future, and therefore came to a more positive affirmation. That having been said, there's serious ambivalence, and the ambivalence particularly strong in the left of Christian in America, because the left in general has developed a kind of very ambivalent attitude toward the state of Israel, particularly the radical left, on the grounds that ex-colonials have a sacred status, and one cannot make judgments. And to me, this is one of the tragedies of the last 50, 70 years, because I think the left has really hurt itself. I'm a person of the left, and so I feel it particularly keenly. But when you start making religious and moral judgments, that former victims cannot be judged by the same standards, it becomes very destructive, not only of moral structures, it becomes destructive of the former victims, because they don't get feedback. I mean, I say again, think about it for a moment. Islam, Muslims, have spent 70 years in the course of which it has become almost a consensus that the Jews have no right to be there, no right to exist, in which you end up being sympathetic to terrorism or suicide bombers. It is a very shocking, and you have serious main leaders who preach incitement that you have a right to wipe out Israel if you could, and you should. It's extremely corrupting to not just the attitude to Jews, it's corrupting to the whole religion. But they never got the feedback. And that's the saddest part of it all. In other words, they never got the feedback, we're with you, we think you have a legitimate cause, we want to support you. But you can't preach and you can't stand it. You can't make your dignity as an independent state contingent on the destruction of another people. And so since they never got the feedback, the result is that these are still respectable positions. These are still things you can say. These are things, and even if the people don't agree with the extreme version of it, they don't feel they have a right to condemn it or stop it. And it's a paradox that people who will try to criticize here are sort of on the defensive rather than the obvious and so. So the result is you don't get the feedback and self-correction. Well, how does that show up in the Christian theological lens? It shows up to the extent that the left, particularly, has been willing to see Israel through some of the old classic anti-Semitic tropes now said, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm really anti-Zionist. Namely, the Jews are controlling, the Jews are abusive, the Jews are mistreating people in the form of inhuman behaviors. And as I said, when a respectable and decent church votes for divestment, and this is the one country I haven't voted for divesting from, from countries that have committed mass murder and mass slaughter and genocide and cultural suppression. It really, I think, is because it evokes a kind of the old trope, now respectable. In other words, the Jews in their carnal incarnate form are not acceptable and not legitimate. It's not that they make mistakes, not that they're wrong. It's not that they're incorrect, that they are sort of beyond the pale. What divestment and boycott is about is not correcting errors or mistreatment. It's about delegitimating the country. So again, the question is, what's the future theological lens that will win out? I'll give you a negative example from the other side. American evangelical support for Israel, which has been remarkable, identifying with the idea this is biblical fulfillment, and which says you have to bless the Jews and support them. I was in Israel recently. I met with Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, who leads something called the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. It turns out that primarily supported by evangelical Christians, it turns out it's the single largest philanthropic support of Israel in the world. And this is coming from, typically the giver is not, they're not big givers, they're not wealthy people. They're people who feel as part of their Christian identification with the Bible and with God's promise of blessing, and blessing the Jews and blessing those who bless the Jews. They support. So that's the good side. The danger and the bad side of this theological lens, of course, is some of them then say, well, so if this is the biblical fulfillment, then we've got to support those Jews who say, take the whole country back as the biblical Israel, that one has to support the Jews, including those who say, I can't make room for the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the catch is, which is going to win out, the mature theological understanding that says, yes, it's biblical, it's miraculous, but it's real life. And in real life, no country gets a blank check. And no people can avoid abuse if they have to rule by force over another population. So the real task here, theologically, is to support it, and to support it, but to encourage it to restraint and to look for that compromise, for that solution that makes room for both sides. So paradoxically, in all three religions, we find the same, to me, fascinating challenge, which is the positive theological lens, the affirmation of the other. Can that side win out over the side that says, I am the exclusive and dominant, and God is on my side, and I can do it my way? Will the dominant theological side that says, this is a biblical country, therefore it must live up to the highest standards, and if it ever makes mistakes or does bad things, it's not just bad, it's to be totally condemned. Is that side going to win out, or will the side that says, yes, we have a vision of perfection, we have a vision of the future messianism, but we understand that you must work in the real world now with qualification, with compromise, with flaws, and do the best to keep the flaws limited and the positive strong. So I conclude with that as the paradox and the fascinating challenge. In Israel, it's the internal resources. Can the religious impulses that bind to the land and that inspire a sense of vision that we can make a perfect society in the future, can that side mature and take on in itself the tremendous challenge of living day to day with trying to keep control and security without having to crush or suppress another people? Can that side win out and say, I have to exercise restraint and pass up a political gain in order to make room for the other person? Or will the side of dominance, exclusiveness, and special relationship to God win out? In Christianity, it's very much the same challenge. Can I make room for a pluralism that affirms my own faith and a deep commitment, but nevertheless at the same moment sees my partner, my ally in the Jewish people, but I want to support that side that wants to accept religion in the real world and understand the limits and the pluralism that's necessary if you're trying to function religiously in the real world. And in Islam. Now, I want to finish by saying I think I'm an optimist, despite the fact that there are these dangers. I'm struck that after 70 years, despite being under continual siege, Israel has not turned chauvinist and racist and totally angry. And it occurred to me recently that a majority of Israelis, have had a member of the family or a close relative either die or be wounded or injured, either in war or in terrorist action. It's an amazing statistic when you consider the fact, despite that there's anti-Arab feelings, but this remains marginalized, remains politically beyond the pale. So there are tremendous inner resources, despite being under siege for 70 years. Israelis have made a tremendous effort when they do go to war to minimize civilian casualties. And at no great sacrifice, no small sacrifice, they have done so. Just one statistic. In the Gaza War, it turned out, according to the UN's count, which is not a very reliable, typically one-sided, 1,426 civilians out of approximately 2,600 dead in Gaza. But here is the irony and the paradox of it. The Israelis have, because this has become an issue everywhere through, literally name by name, step by step, have gone through the list of the people. It turns out that the number of civilian deaths in this case is roughly 1-to-1, meaning for every soldier or person identified as combatant, there's a one civilian death. Now, what's the significance of that statistic? Well, Richard Kemp, who was the head of the British forces in Afghanistan, testified in 2012 that American and British troops, the Allies in Afghanistan, had made a superhuman effort to restrict civilian casualties because they felt it's morally wrong and because they felt also they're going to lose the local population support. He said, and as a result, they brought it down to between 3.4-to-1. And he said this was the highest achievement in military history. I mean, these things weren't always measured, that's an estimate. Because it's very difficult, particularly difficult when the enemy mixes consciously in the population. So my point is to achieve 1-to-1. On the one hand, it shows the tragedy and the suffering of war and the difficulty when you go to war. On the other hand, it shows the amazing effort that was done. So after 70 years, not to have lost the self-restraint, not to have lost the capacity to still work on trying to minimize the death is a remarkable accomplishment. Again, but no guarantee. And I think the longer there is no settlement, the harder it is to live that way. But I'm optimistic because I sort of feel that the better side will come out. I feel the same way about Christianity and even about Islam, that there is an opportunity in this time and age for the mature religion, for the religion that understands that because God is on our side doesn't mean we have absolute power, because the religion that understands that even repairing the world and making it messianically perfect can only be achieved in flawed and limited ways. I think the possibility in each religion of a mature version that reinforces pluralism and compromise and working together is there. If that happens, of course, then I think the future of the state of Israel will also fall into line. But I don't see it happening tomorrow, and the test remains, paradoxically, in all three religions. Can they continue to mature and develop kind of this new pluralist form of religious commitment? I think I look forward to working on it. I think Jewish-Christian relations shows that miracles of transformation are possible, and I hope that this will now be extended to the whole world. Thank you.